Hello everyone, how have you been? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. I'm Mari Thurger, and today I'm going to talk about gods that are twin brothers, focusing on the Germanic cultural past and myths that might indicate the idea of twin gods. So I can answer one of my patrons' questions actually concerning Freyr and Freyja, and in comparison with Dionysus and Aphrodite, if they are representations of twin gods and if there are any similarities between these two pairs of deities. To be more specific, the question was if there is in fact any relation between Freyr and Freyja with the Greek divine couple Dionysus and Aphrodite, as well as a cult related to Gemini within the religious reality of Northern Europe in relation to Freyr and Freyja. And to me, in all honesty, the answer is no, most likely. There isn't a relation between these two realities or between these gods from different pantheons. And I shall explain why throughout this video. It's true that there are evidences of gods, some evidences of gods being twin brothers in some Germanic mythological contexts, and we can see similarities with some classical religious ideas of twin deities as well. However, it isn't likely that Freyr and Freyja were ever understood to be twin gods in Northern Europe in the pagan past, for the simple fact that they are male and female. And European mythologies present us twin deities as being male of the same sex and not of two different sexes. And this is something important to take into consideration due to the mentality of the past. It's entirely possible if these myths were created in our modern times with our modern mentality. I have no doubt that probably we would easily put Freyr and Freyja as twins. But in order to understand why they are not twins, we must understand the mentality of the past and the social structures of such societies of the past. And as such, we will soon understand, I think, that Freyr and Freyja are two polarities, brother and sister, but not twins. Literally, their names meaning the Lord and the Lady, the divine representation of the chieftain and his wife, the usual pattern of hieros gamos, the sacred marriage of two important powers that hold the foundations of ancient societies, especially those of the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, in which the chieftain or the war leader or the war chief and his wife were the social, religious, political, and military powers that governed these societies. The union between the sacred and the profane, the religious and the magical, the political and the ritual. Hieros gamos as the sacred marriage or union between God and goddess, enacted by the male and female powers of a society as the symbolic ritual of the representation of the union of the divine and reenacting this powerful union within the human society to express and manifest that power within that same human society. A ritual ceremony often conducted infertility rituals, but of course also political and military alliances, precisely to consolidate the power, peace, and plenty and prosperity. After all, Freyr and Freyja not only are the Lord and the Lady, but also the gods of peace and plenty. And their sacred union is important to give way to the continuation of peace and plenty upon the human world and within the human society, precisely by reenacting this sacred union in ritual ceremony. It's always important to remember that in ancient societies, much of the mythological accounts, especially concerning creational myths, were reenacted on several occasions precisely to manifest such creational powers in the human world, within the human society. And these were very much part of fertility cults, these ceremonies, to get in touch with the life-giving deities. And to get in touch with such deities, it was necessary to conduct certain ceremonies and rituals, especially with a sexual character. This is when we enter in the part of the marriage and consummating the marriage through the sexual act by the ruling powers, by the lord and the lady, the chieftain and the chieftess, the king and the queen. And this would also be followed by ceremonial orgies in which the subjects would participate in this reenactment of the sacred union. The orgy here as a reenactment of the power and life-giving forces of the gods. And through this ceremony, the energy of such powers would fall upon the human community and propitiate a plentiful year of wealth, peace, and plenty and prosperity, bringing to life the creational and life-giving powers and manifest them within the human community to make it possible for creation and fertility to be repeated once again and continue the cycle of life. This whole thing might sound a little bit silly, perhaps, for today's standards. I'm well aware of that, but after all, mentalities change all the time, and with it also our perceptions of the world and what we consider to be sacred or not. So indeed, we must try our very best to transport ourselves into the past, to try to perceive the mentality of those times without influencing it with our modern religious and social constructions. And it isn't that hard, at least in terms of this sexual ceremonial display I've just referred to previously, because these same ritualistic ceremonies are still being performed by spiritual leaders in many societies still existing today. Many spiritual leaders of a community, the ones we commonly name or label shamans, these shamans, these spiritual leaders, still recreate and reenact mythological events, especially related to creation and life-giving entities, still recreate this in ritual and ceremony within their communities. If I'm not mistaken, I've already spoken about this before on the video concerning sexuality and gender identity in shamanism. And the part I have shared with all of you about the performances from the part of the spiritual leader, the shaman, with sexual connotations, precisely to arouse sexuality among the community, to propitiate fertility, ritualized sexual performances to ensure the flowing of sexual desire so the community may grow and may thrive, precisely by the reenactment of cosmological energy, forces, and powers concerned with the renewal of the world and life. And the spiritual leader manifests such powers within the community through a ceremony, through a ritual. So we still find many parallels in such living traditions, and we can compare with religious acts of pagan societies of the past. But anyway, for us to understand why Freyr and Freyja are not twins and also differentiate them from Dionysus and Aphrodite of the Greek pantheon, we must first take a look at the evidences we may have concerning twin gods in a Germanic and classical contexts and how such conceptions match one another. I will not delve too deep into this subject, so I won't waste your time, but I shall give, I think, and I hope I shall give important conceptions, and then I'm sure you will pick up and see similarities in other mythologies. And please, by all means, do share in the comments other insights and other myths you are more familiar with that express the things that shall be shared in this video, throughout this video. So let's start from there, the case of twin gods, please. So I think the question is, were there any twin deities worshipped among Germanic peoples? The truth is, we don't know for sure, but there might have been. There are some clues that may indicate Germanic peoples once worshipped twin gods, sons of the god of the sky. Maybe, probably. We can find a few traces in the surviving myths, but with little success. mostly because when the myths were finally written down, it was in a period and by people culturally, religiously, and geographically distanced from the heathen past, the pagan past. So first, we must look for a similar pattern in other mythologies. Of course, as I said, I'm not going to deal with every mythology and every deity there is. It's impossible, not only because well, it's simply too many gods, but also there are some mythologies I'm not familiar with. I mean, do you know everyone in your city? Everyone in your neighborhood? Well, the same thing with the gods. There's just too many of them and little time to get to know them all. So, by all means, share your insight about other gods and other mythologies in the comments below. It helps us all exchanging information, right? We teach each other and learn from one another. With this being said, perhaps it's useful to look for similar patterns in cultures closer to Northern European ones and with whom Germanic peoples interacted quite a lot during the Late Bronze Age and also the Iron Age, of course, and early Middle Ages as well, and from whom many cultural factors were adopted, were accepted and incorporated and added. So, I think the most famous twins we know of in European mythological context are Castor and Pollux, or Castor and Pollux. Not Bollocks, but Pollux, which is why I think it's preferable to say in Greek. And if I'm not mistaken, in modern Greek is Polydeuces. Anyway, the twin half-brothers in Greek and Roman mythology, which together are known as the Dioscuri in Latin, the sons of Zeus, and also in Latin as Gemini, twins, Gemini. So, the twin sons of Zeus, Castor and Pollux, they were horsemen celebrated within the Mediterranean cultures. Now, this is when we must tread lightly. We have a series of Greek historians and geographers commenting on what they witnessed throughout Europe and beyond. Most of their works are based on hearsay from sailors and soldiers and merchants that went about several places and described what they saw. So, more or less in the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Greeks described that twin gods were worshipped along the coast of the North Sea. And that's it. Most of these Greek accounts, even since the famous geographer and historian Strabo, are always about peoples along the coast, somewhat from a safe distance, and even those who had close contact with such peoples, they did not venture very far inland. So much of these accounts are indeed from cultures near the coastline, so what they did might not have been shared by all the others far inland, right? Also, we have the Roman Tacitus, whose works are also mainly based on hearsay and accounts from others. He himself not actually having been in the places he describes or having had direct contact with the peoples he describes. And much of his works, especially Germania, is more of a critique towards Rome and its political and moral state at the time, rather than a thorough work of investigation about the Germanic tribes. Still, Tacitus mentioned the tribe of the Nahar Valley, which resided where it is nowadays, southwestern Poland, more or less in there. And he says that this tribe worshipped twin gods similar to Castor and Pollux. Tacitus describes the similarities between the cult of the twin gods of the Nahar Valley, this Germanic tribe, and the Roman cult of the twins. And he concludes that even though there are striking similarities, the twin cult of the Nahar Valley is not an imitation of the Roman one, but one native to this Germanic tribe. These twin gods were called the Alkies, worshipped in a sacred grove, pay close attention at that, and the priests of this cult dressed like women. Remember that. Alkies, of course, a Latin designation for these gods, but surprisingly similar to Proto-Germanic Alkies, which means stag. So could be twin stag gods, but I think that's pushing a little bit too far, perhaps. But also quite similar to the twin Vedic gods Ashwin, the twin deities associated with the dawn in Hindu mythology, described as young horsemen, just like the Roman Castor and Pollux and the Greek Castor and Polydux. So could the Germanic Alkies be a version of the same twin gods but riding stags? Well, we don't know their original Germanic names, and Alkies is indeed the Latinization of these gods, a Latin name closer to the Vedic gods Ashwin. So we've seen some parallels in here. Sad to say that this is the only thing we can say about these Alkies twin gods of this Germanic tribe, and little else is known. However, we see some similarities in here. The problem with this is that indeed these Alkies gods, the twin gods of the Germanic tribe, may have been a Mediterranean influence, even though Tacitus concludes that these are not imitations of the Roman twins, but they may in fact have been, and it wouldn't be surprising. But I want to pick on the idea of the twin gods riding horses, not mentioned, of course, in the particular cult of the Alkies, but on other twin gods of Greek, Roman, and Hindu mythologies. And honorable mention to the famous Anglo-Saxon heroes Hengiste or Hengiste and Horsa, meaning stallion and horse, who may have also been twin legendary heroes, and as you know, who played an important part in the foundation of the Kingdom of Kent. And again, we see an association with horses in here. So it's important to reflect upon the case of the horses and their importance in Germanic context. But I would also like to focus on the detail about the Germanic priests of the cult of the twin gods Alkies dressed as women. The priests dress as women, but we shall see this further ahead. I'm not going into great details concerning horses and horse augury, or horses used for divination purposes among Germanic peoples, because I've already done at least 2 videos about that, and don't worry, I'll leave them down below in the description of this video. But suffice it to say that among Germanic peoples, especially in the case of continental old Germans of the Iron Age, they believed that horses were sacred to the gods. White horses, to be more precise, which were kept in sacred groves. They would harness the horses to a specific and a special chariot and observe the horse's behavior, and thus made an interpretation of the will of the gods based on what they observed. This is particularly interesting because in the cult of the Alkies, we know it was performed in a sacred grove as well. In Scandinavia, in what is now southern Sweden, there is a reference to a Norse deity called Litir, a fertility deity equivalent to Freyr. Litir seems to have been a Swedish god who presided over fate related to divination and horses. One of the divination methods used in southern Sweden was by the use of a chariot pulled by horses, and the image of a deity similar to Freyr, and in fact, in some cases, in some accounts, indeed, Freyr himself, the image of the god Freyr, would be pulled and taken into the hall, where the king would speak with the image of this deity, and through the king's mouth, the deity would deal out prophecy. Don't worry, this is just a very short summary of what I have already said in those 2 videos concerning horses, to avoid repeating myself and to avoid wasting your time. The important thing to retain in here is that to the Germanic peoples, horses were kept in sacred groves, and their behavior was observed as a form of divination, augury. And that in Scandinavia, in what is now at least southern Sweden, horses were used for the exact same purpose and also associated with deities of fertility, either Freyr or male gods similar to Freyr with the same attributes. Now, among the Swedes, we have two famous twin kings, which were Alfr or Halfe and Yngvi. Alfr literally means elf, and Yngvi is the god Freyr. Now, hold on. Freyr is often mentioned in the sources as the king or lord of the elves, as elves are associated with the dead and burial mounds and the ancestors, and Freyr at Old Uppsala was worshipped at his own burial mound, a burial mound created to contain the god Freyr himself and to which offerings were deposited. Yngvi often appears in Old Norse compounds such as Yngvi Freyr and Inguna Freyr, both of which mean Lord of the Ingwins. That's the thing, Freyr literally means Lord, the Lord. He is the Lord, a god associated with fertility, divination, the burial mound, and horses. Yngvi and Freyr are the same. Both names often come together because it literally means Lord of the Ingwins. Not the penguins, but of the Ingwins. But in some sources, they also come separated as two distinct deities. Now, this either indicates that the two deities are the same or were syncretized at some very early point, probably during the Germanic migration period. If they are two deities, or if they were two deities, we have here yet another trace of the twin gods associated with horses, whose cult often involved horses or the use of horses for divination purposes. Now, of course, we must not forget that Freyr has a sister, Freyja, which literally means lady, the lady. But this wouldn't have been a case of both being twins, because the strongest clues we have concerning twin gods, at least in the European context, cultural context, is that they are male and related to horses, and Freyja is not. So if in Scandinavia there was any survival traces of twin gods, might have been Yngvi and Freyr, often coming together as either two gods of the same or the same god, with which is the product of syncretic faiths. And now we return to that detail of the priests of the cult of the Alkies twins, presenting themselves dressed as women. One of the very interesting details about the cult of Freyr at certain occasions, during the sacrifices dedicated to Freyr at Old Uppsala, is that all the performance or the procession until the place of sacrifice, it was led by the priests of Freyr and other men who would express effeminate gestures. And Saxo Grammaticus describes this in his Gesta Danorum, and he considers this whole procession to be very unmanly. So yet another parallel here concerning Freyr and the cult of the twin gods, the Alkies, especially in relation to the Alkies, which Tacitus describes, the priests of such a cult dressed as women. But anyway, this is as far as we are able to get. Scattered pieces here and there, as you can see, but indeed they suggest the probable existence of twin gods among Germanic peoples. And Freyr is indeed the best candidate and the only pre-Christian Scandinavian deity that shows any possible evidences of having been associated with a cult to twin gods. So it's somewhat easy to jump into assumptions that Freyr and Freyja were twins because they were brother and sister. But that is just speculation. The likely scenario would have been Yngvi and Freyr in Scandinavia and the Alkies among the old Germans of continental Europe. But that is also speculation. But concerning the Alkies, or whatever their name might have been aside from this Latinization, it's clear that the Alkies seem to have been completely forgotten, especially in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, at least by the time the myths were finally committed to parchment. In a much later period, and at least 200 to 300 years after Christianity became the official religion of Scandinavian countries and medieval kingdoms. It's true, there are many similarities between European gods and European cultures due to a remote past when, more or less, almost every prehistoric community shared similarities in their early cults because they came from the same cultural and social religious sources. Or rather, better still, humanity has always been on the move all the time and trading several goods with each other, and ideas and objects travel more than people. So the case of cultural syncretism and syncretic faiths has been a reality since humans have been interacting with each other. So of course we find similarities, and we find the same deities with different names or specific details of a cult inserted into another cult. But it is also true that many similarities exist because they have been created during the Renaissance period, or rather, during the consolidation of Western and Eastern magical practices that fused many cultural realities into one single religious or spiritual reality that formed the basis of modern occultism. So we also have to be very careful with that, because one thing are clear historical cultural syncretisms, another thing is modern assumptions that try to further develop the similarities within several religions and forcibly create patterns that were not originally there. I think that's natural. We humans are prone to find patterns, and we often create interesting alternative realities that there were never there to begin with. On the case of Norse mythology, you all know that the main source, sadly, for the study of the Norse myths has been the prose Edda mainly, even though there are hundreds of other sources. It's a work composed by Snorri Sturluson, and as I've said many times, he was a Christian, and much of the Norse myths are Christianized ideas of the pagan past. But Snorri wasn't just a Christian, he also had access to classical myths, which by his own time, the 13th century, the classical myths were also and already a Christian version of the ancient Greek pagan myths. So basically what we have in here during this period are Christians compiling the old myths and getting pieces here and there, but seldom impartial. So a lot of religious conceptions of their own time were added to the several myths they were compiling, especially to fill in the gaps and create comparisons. On top of all of this, the 13th century is precisely the time in which the consolidation of magical practices were taking place in Italy. Furthermore, Kabbalistic teachings were spreading in Europe, and many great Kabbalistic minds and teachers settled in, especially in southern Spain and in Germany, to where many scholars flocked to be introduced into the Kabbalah. And I have no doubt Snorri Sturluson himself was quite familiar with such spiritual and occultic realities. And this isn't speculation, because Snorri was an Icelander, and it is precisely in Iceland, of course between the 16th and the 19th centuries, that we have a great deal of grimoires with the famous Icelandic magical staves, which the great majority of them are, in fact, neither from the Viking Age nor of Scandinavian pre-Christian tradition. Magical staves, such as the famous Vegvisir and the Hegisjalmur, and many other Icelandic magical staves, are in fact based on the tradition of the Key of Solomon. And we have several mentions that such grimoires already existed in the late Middle Ages, and possibly at least since the 13th and 14th centuries. But I shall develop more about this in the future, don't worry. The point here is that we see in the Icelandic magical staves the influence of pan-European occultic literature, which was in great development and spreading all over Europe already precisely during Snorri's time, and of course the centuries that would follow. So we also see these pan-European occult ideas within the prose Edda itself, which sadly has been taken as the ultimate source of Norse mythology, even though there are plenty of other sources. Snorri's prose Edda isn't just a Christianized version of the Norse myths. From start to finish, in many parts, it's almost a copy of the Christianized Greek myths as well. And in fact, the prose Edda starts in Troy and the events of the Trojan War. By the lack of sources, Snorri had to fill in the gaps with a lot of literature of his own time, both classical myths, but also occultic literature. And for those who are familiar with the occult and the teachings of the Kabbalah, we'll find many similarities within the prose Edda itself. I'm sure of it. Let me give you an interesting example and the use of the number 12. So you might understand the spiritual fusion that was going on during Snorri's time and during the Renaissance period. Precisely during the Renaissance consolidation of the Western and Eastern magical practices, many mythologies were on the table, so to speak, and a sort of compendium of the mythologies was forged to connect them all into reaching a unique spiritual understanding or a unique spiritual truth. In every mythology and every legendary religion of the world, all of a sudden, during the Renaissance period, there was this idea of one single place above all others, which became the great ideal of those religions on the making and occultic organizations. To Northern Europe, it was Valhalla, which the name itself is wrong. A place that had been originally situated in Hell, in the underworld, and by Snorri's hand, it became the divine realm, the equivalent of paradise. Valhalla was relocated, was shifted, and became a place situated on the top of the highest mountains in Asgard, connected to the earth by the rainbow bridge Bifrost. Among the Greeks, Mount Olympus was held sacred, and here the gods are said to have lived high on top of a mountain. Again, the same parallel. The Knights of the Grail are said to have had their castle among the crags and peaks of northern Spain on Mount Salvat. So, in every religion of the world, there are many examples. There is this sacred spot, Meru to the Oriental and Mount Moria and Mount Sinai. I'm not denying the historical similarities between religions. As I said, cultural syncretism and syncretic faiths is the most natural behavior when each human group and civilization comes in contact with each other. However, we have to be careful because in the European Middle Ages, there are even more similarities in myths that weren't originally there, which are the product of occultic teachings and literature of that time, of that period, which of course, obviously, has influenced a lot our civilizations for centuries to come. The previously mentioned examples of a place above the clouds or in mountains or some high place, all of these are symbols and ideas of one universal ideal. And as each of these religions claimed among the clouds a castle or a sacred home or a realm of the divine, so it was finally reached an agreement by occultists of the Middle Ages that all religions of the world have their headquarters in Shambhala, the sacred city high above the clouds in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. So, what I mean with all of this is that, of course, there are similarities between religions, but many of them were also purposely created at some point during the early Middle Ages. Many similarities are from a prehistoric past, but many more come from medieval and modern European occult movements. which formed the basis of many religious orders and organizations such as the Golden Dawn, the Freemasons, etc. The Aesir became 12 in number. We return to the number 12. Just like the Olympian gods, 12 in number. And the 12 members of the Great White Brotherhood. And the 12 zodiac signs. And so on and so forth. There was an attempt to create a world religion with indisputable similarities and even equal religious ideas. So, of course, we find so many similarities. They have been purposely created by the same spiritual societies and organizations and occultic groups to which Snorri Sturluson most likely belonged to. So, always doubt everything, especially what we think we know and is deemed to be common knowledge. I mean, a lie told many times becomes the truth, and no one will ever remember the time when the lie and the truth fused. Our grandparents believed in something and have passed it down to their children and to their children's children. And so people continue to believe in something and act in a certain way because if their ancestors did it, it's obviously normal and right, and we do it or believe in it because it became normal and it became the only truth, the indisputable truth. And we never stop for a moment to doubt and question why we do what we do and why we believe in the things we believe. So, this is exactly what happens or what has happened with Freyr and Freyja and Dionysus and Aphrodite. You have noticed, of course, that before, in the historical case of the cult of the twin brothers, I haven't mentioned anywhere Dionysus and Aphrodite, because they were not twins. The original classical cult of twin gods always points to male gods, and in the case of Mediterranean classical cultures, it was Castor and Pollux for the Romans, and Castor and Polydux for the Greeks. The idea of Dionysus and Aphrodite being twins is a later development within some occultic traditions, not all, but some occultic traditions, to forcibly find patterns and link it all together. There wasn't an original similarity. Most of the similarities we find in these two pairs of gods, Freyr and Freyja and Dionysus and Aphrodite, was brought to us by the same people who attempted to create a world religion. Mind that I'm not saying that the idea of a world religion is wrong or right. I'm just stating the facts today on this video. Anyway, historically speaking, and concerning the study of classical mythologies, what is the relationship between Aphrodite and Dionysus after all? Well, this highly depends on the version of the story, of course. Dionysus' parents are commonly told as being Zeus and Semele. Aphrodite, on the other hand, in one version, she is the daughter of Uranus. Uranus is the grandfather of Zeus, so Aphrodite is Zeus' father's half-sister, making her Zeus' great aunt. And Zeus is the father of Dionysus, so Aphrodite is Dionysus' great-great aunt. On another version of the myths, she was the daughter of Zeus and Dion. So in this case, she is the half-sister of Dionysus. In conclusion, in both versions, Dionysus and Aphrodite are not Gemini. They are not twins. Freyr and Freyja, indeed, they seem to be Gemini, twins, being both the children of Njordr, who originally was both male and female, being an hermaphroditic deity, which we find in other entities of Norse myths and as well as other world mythologies. Freyr and Freyja are the personification of the two polarities needed to create life. They are both gods of fertility, love and sex and peace and plenty, precisely because everything in nature in a Germanic prehistoric perception, needs two polarities, two opposites, male and female, to give life. Freyr and Freyja could be seen as Gemini by us modern humans with our modern perceptions and our predisposition to find patterns based on the forced similarities created during the late medieval and modern European religious orders. But I highly doubt Germanic peoples of the past, of the Neolithic and Bronze Age, but mostly of the Iron Age, saw these two deities as Gemini. The gods were the personification of the natural reality people lived in. Freyr and Freyja are no more than personifications of the fertility of the natural world, in the most basic sense, of course. But also their names literally mean the Lord and the Lady, a powerful union observable in nature and through the ceremonial conception of Eros Gamos, the sacred marriage, spoken previously at the beginning of this video. The human communities make a ceremonial and ritualistic reenactment of this divine union, personified in the figures of literally the Lord and the Lady, the chieftain and his wife, the chieftess, the king and the queen, the elite couple that formed the basis of governance among many cultures. Actually, the top of the pyramid, especially cultures of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Freyr was originally the divine king and specifically and only the god of the Swedes. And later on, Freyr was eventually added to the general Norse pantheon during the Nordic Middle Ages, but mostly post-Viking period, precisely when Snorri tries to create a unique myth and consolidate various Old Norse gods from different pre-Christian Scandinavian cultural backgrounds. Snorri tries to create something that did not in fact exist in pre-Christian Scandinavia, which was a unique pantheon, a sort of organized religion everyone subscribed to. That never existed in pre-Christian Scandinavia. There were several belief systems, there were several entities and gods, and what one region might have worshipped, the region next to it was worshipping something else or entities similar to the others. It was too diverse, and there wasn't a structured belief system, let alone an actual organized religion. It's Snorri Sturluson that compiles several elements and scattered pieces, fills in the gaps as well, and adds several religious elements of his own time in an attempt to create a structured mythology. J.R.R. Tolkien would do the exact same thing, of course, many centuries after. Due to the lack of a pre-Christian Old English mythology and structured religion, Tolkien created the Lord of the Rings. But perhaps most importantly for this case is the creation of the Silmarillion, a sort of mythological companion to form the basis of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Both Tolkien and Snorri were Christians, were familiar with an organized and well-structured religion, and face to face with their pre-Christian past, they faced the challenge of trying to figure out what were people of their own geographical areas, what were they actually worshipping in the pre-Christian past. So they collected pieces, some evidences, filled in the gaps, they even fantasized. They formed something else that did not originally exist in the pagan past of their own ancestors, in their own geographical reality. Besides, originally, the continental Germanic peoples did not worship Freyja nor Freyr. They worshipped Freyja, which is both Frigg and at a certain point in Scandinavia became also Freyja, but would become Frigg or Frigga. And they also worshipped Godin, a version of Odin, and worshipped Njordr as male and female, whom the Romans called Nerthos, hence the confusion between Nerthos and Njordr. They were the same and neither female nor male, but an hermaphroditic deity, which is the personification of the earth itself. Only in Scandinavia, the same goddess Freyja or Frigga would be divided eventually into two, Freyja and Frigg. In Scandinavia, it was Freyja who was worshipped more than any other female deity, and as much as Thor and Freyr. And as I said, Freyr was originally the divine king and god of the Swedes only, which then it was also Freyr added to the general Norse pantheon during the late Viking period and post-Viking period. So in conclusion, originally Freyr and Freyja were not even brothers, possibly, but later on became brothers in a fused mixture of Germanic Bronze Age and Iron Age religions, consolidated during the Scandinavian Middle Ages, mostly the Viking Age. In truth, by what we can see from prehistoric Germanic religions, Freyr and Freyja, masculine and feminine respectively, in reality they have probably been at some point regarded as the same hermaphroditic deity, just like their father-mother, Njord/Nerthos. It's quite common in Proto-Indo-European religions, the same deity with both sexes, or the same deity represented in multiple aspects, often four faces, the duplicity or the multiplicity of genders as well. But let's also remember that most mythologies we know of nowadays, their hierarchical construction began during the Bronze Age, precisely with the real hierarchization of the early Bronze Age tribal societies. Real people became gods. The Vanir appear to have been either an ancient Proto-Germanic tribe, or most likely the people of the Baltic, who were at war with the Aesir Germanic tribe. So we seem to have in here, in the conflict between the Vanir and the Aesir, a clashing of different peoples and different cultures. In fact, it's quite possible that the Aesir are actually a real people coming from the Middle East, probably Assyrian peoples who were forced to migrate further north during the first century of the Common Era, of course, in order to escape Roman occupation. And so these Assyrian peoples, upon coming north, they clashed with the Neolithic cultures around the Baltic and southern Scandinavia, probably. This war or this conflict was later elevated to mythological status, and Freyja, probably a living individual in his or her own time, later became an honorary member of the Aesir gods, exchange of hostages to keep the peace, which was also quite common among Bronze Age and Iron Age European societies. So yeah, all right, a little bit of speculation in here. I know, I'm well aware of that, but we clearly aren't facing a case of twins. That's the point. But for Greco-Roman Gemini cult, aside from what was previously spoken, and twins as male and female, not Dionysus and Aphrodite, but perhaps we should be looking at the shining twins Apollo and Artemis, who celebrated the sacred marriage by mating in Leto's womb, which is the enclosed garden, as you know it, just like the divine twins Osiris and Isis, which also have mated in the womb. So we see parallels in here, similarities. Or perhaps we can find some other similarities in Romulus and Remus, which are just another reference to the archaic myth of the twins who are seen as inseparable friends, in part, as in the case of Castor and Pollux, or enemies like Seth and Osiris, and Cain and Abel, or the sons of Epermanestra and Lekios, the idea of one brother kills the other, or temporary enemies like almost all the legendary and mythological brothers like Apollo and Hermes, and that would also correspond to the Chaldean tradition of the first pair of children of Tiamat and Apsu, and Lahmu and Lahamu. And we also have the ancient Swedish legendary brothers and kings who killed one another, Halrik and Heirik. So we have a lot of examples here. It's a hypothesis that these twins and twin cults, Gemini cults, correspond to a solar analogy to describe the astronomical reality of the constellation of the Gemini. Anyway, I'm drifting away from the subject. These are all subjects for other times, perhaps. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed yet another video. As you can see, in the case of twin brothers in a Germanic context, there's more speculation than anything else. But there are some historical traces that may point to a cult to twin gods among Germanic peoples at some point, probably during the Iron Age, and most likely an influence from Mediterranean classical cultures. Anyway, once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, back for deal. Thanks for today.